teacup shattered on the marble floor before Clara Bennett even reached the study door. She froze, her hand still raised to knock, the silver tray trembling slightly in her other palm. Inside the room, she heard nothing. No shout, no curse. Just silence, thick and strange, the kind that made the back of her neck prickle. She pushed the door open slowly. Duke Edmund Whitmore stood by the window, his back straight, his hands folded behind him, as if nothing had happened at all. On the floor near his desk lay the broken pieces of a porcelain cup, the same pattern of blue flowers that Clara had seen every single morning since she started working at Ashcombe Hall 3 weeks ago. "Bring another one tomorrow." Clara's heart pounded. She had been warned. Margaret Hollis, the head housekeeper, had pulled her aside on her very first day and said the words plainly. Never ask the Duke about his tea. Never ask why he orders it and never drinks it. Never ask about the broken pieces that sometimes appear on the floor of his study. Just clean, serve, and stay silent. But something about the way he stood there, so still, so controlled, and yet so clearly shaken, made Clara's curiosity burn brighter than her fear. "Your Grace," she said carefully, "shall I bring a fresh cup now, or in the morning?" He turned his head just slightly. Not enough to look at her directly, but enough that she could see the sharp line of his jaw, the tiredness around his eyes that no amount of good tailoring could hide. "In the morning," he said, "always in the morning, 7 o'clock, not a minute before, not a minute after." Then he walked past her, out of the study, leaving her alone with the broken cup and a question she was not allowed to ask. That night, Clara could not sleep. She lay on her narrow bed in the servants' quarters, staring at the low ceiling, listening to the wind push against the old stone walls of the house. Ashcombe Hall was enormous, older than anyone could remember, filled with long hallways and locked doors and portraits of people whose names nobody spoke anymore. She thought about the tea. Every single morning, precisely at 7, she was to carry a tray to the Duke's private sitting room. On it, 1 pot of black tea, 1 cup, 1 small plate of sugar, and nothing else. He would be seated in his chair by the fireplace, reading or simply staring at the flames, and he would nod when she entered. She would pour the tea. She would leave. And when she returned an hour later to collect the tray, the tea would be untouched, cold, sitting exactly where she had left it. It was such a small thing, a cup of tea that no one drank, and yet it had taken over her thoughts completely. The next morning, she rose before the sun, dressed quickly, and made her way down to the kitchen. Mrs. Ellery, the cook, was already awake, kneading dough with flour dusted across her forearms. "You're up early," Mrs. Ellery said without looking up. "I wanted to prepare the Duke's tray myself," Clara said. Mrs. Ellery paused, her hands going still for just a moment. "Best not to think too much about that tray, dear. Some things in this house are better left as they are." "Why?" Clara asked. "It's only tea." The older woman wiped her hands on her apron and finally looked at Clara, her expression softer than Clara expected. "Because some habits are not really about the thing itself. They are about holding on to something. And when a man like the Duke holds on to something, you do not pull at it. You let him hold it as long as he needs to." Clara wanted to ask more, but the kettle began to whistle, and the moment passed. At 7 o'clock exactly, she carried the tray down the long corridor toward the east wing, past the tall windows that let in the pale morning light, past the old paintings of ancestors long gone, until she reached the heavy oak door of the Duke's private sitting room. She knocked twice, as she had been taught, and entered when she heard his voice. He was sitting in his usual chair, a book open on his lap, though his eyes were not moving across the page. They were fixed somewhere beyond it, somewhere Clara could not see. "Good morning, Your Grace," she said softly, setting the tray down on the small table beside him. He nodded, the same small nod he gave every day, and said nothing else. She poured the tea, careful not to spill a single drop, and placed the cup exactly where he could reach it, without needing to look. Then she stepped back, waiting for the moment when he would dismiss her with a simple wave of his hand, as he always did. But this time, he spoke. "Do you know what today is?" he asked, still staring at the fire. Clara hesitated. "No, Your Grace." "No," he repeated, almost to himself. "Of course you don't. Why would you?" She stood there, unsure whether to leave or wait, but he said nothing further, and after a long moment, he waved his hand toward the door. She curtsied and left, closing the heavy door softly behind her. Downstairs, the other servants were already busy with their morning tasks. Clara found Oliver, the young footman who had become something of a friend since her arrival, polishing silver in the small pantry near the dining hall. "You look troubled," Oliver said, not looking up from his work. "The Duke said something strange this morning," Clara replied, leaning against the doorframe. "He asked if I knew what day it was." Oliver's hands paused over the silver spoon he was polishing. He glanced toward the door, as if checking that no one else was near, then lowered his voice. "Today is the day," he said. "The day for what?" "Nobody says it out loud," Oliver said. "But every year, around this time, the Duke becomes even quieter than usual. Margaret always tells the staff to be extra careful, extra gentle. There was a woman once, you know, before you came. Before any of us came, really, except old Henry the gardener and Mrs. Ellery." Clara stepped closer. "A woman? Who was she?" Oliver shook his head. "I only know pieces. Nobody speaks of her directly. Her portrait used to hang in the main hall, but it was taken down years ago and moved somewhere else in the house. Some say it is locked away now, in a room nobody is allowed to enter." Clara felt a chill move through her, not from fear, but from the sudden shape the mystery was taking. A woman, a locked room, a cup of tea, untouched every single morning. "Do you think she has something to do with the tea?" Clara asked. Oliver shrugged, though his eyes told a different story, one that suggested he had wondered the very same thing many times before. "I think," he said slowly, "that some questions in this house are better left unanswered. The Duke is a fair employer. He pays well. He is patient with mistakes, and he has never once raised his voice at any of us. But there are lines you do not cross. And that room, whatever is inside it, is one of those lines." Clara nodded, though inside her, the curiosity only grew stronger. Later that day, while carrying fresh linens toward the east wing, Clara found herself walking past a narrow hallway she had never noticed before. It branched off from the main corridor, dim and quiet, ending in a single wooden door with a small brass lock. She should have kept walking, she knew that. But her feet slowed, almost against her own will, and she found herself standing directly in front of the door. There was no sound from inside, no light beneath the frame. Just silence. The same heavy silence she had felt in the study the night before, when the teacup had shattered on the floor. She reached out, almost without thinking, and touched the brass handle. It was cold beneath her fingers. "You should not be here." The voice made her jump, and she spun around to see Margaret Hollis standing at the end of the hallway, her arms crossed, her expression unreadable. "I was only passing by," Clara said quickly. "This hallway leads nowhere useful," Margaret said, walking closer, her footsteps echoing softly against the stone floor. "There is nothing here that concerns your duties." "I did not mean to intrude," Clara said. "I was only curious about the door." Margaret studied her for a long moment, and Clara thought she saw something soften in the older woman's eyes, some flicker of understanding, or perhaps memory. "Curiosity is not a fault," Margaret finally said, "but in this house, it must be balanced with patience. Some things reveal themselves in time, to those who are trusted. Others remain closed, no matter how long you wait." "Is this room one of those things?" Clara asked. Margaret did not answer directly. Instead, she gestured for Clara to follow her back toward the main corridor. "Come. Your work is not finished, and neither is mine." That evening, after her duties were done, Clara sat alone in the small servants' dining room, picking at a plate of bread and cheese, her mind still turning over everything she had learned. A cup of tea untouched every morning. A woman whose portrait had vanished. A locked door in a hallway that led, according to Margaret, nowhere useful. And a Duke who carried grief so quietly that most people in the house had learned to work around it rather than through it. Old Henry, the gardener, shuffled into the room, his boots muddy from working in the gardens, even at this late hour. He was an old man, his hands rough and weathered, his face lined with decades of sun and work. He nodded at Clara as he sat down across from her. "You've got that look," Henry said, reaching for a piece of bread. "The look of someone asking questions they shouldn't." Clara smiled faintly. Is it that obvious? When you've worked in a house as long as I have, Henry said, you learn to read faces the way you read weather, and yours is full of storm clouds tonight. I only want to understand, Clara said. The Duke, the tea, the room down that hallway. It all feels connected, but no one will tell me how. Henry chewed thoughtfully for a moment, before speaking again. There was a woman, he said finally. Her name was Charlotte. She used to walk in the gardens every morning, before the sun was fully up, while the dew was still on the grass. She always said the world looked cleanest at that hour, before anyone had a chance to mess it up. Clara leaned forward, hanging on every word. What happened to her? Henry's eyes grew distant, as if he were looking not at the small dining room around them, but at some memory decades old. That, he said quietly, is not my story to tell, but I will say this. The Duke was not always so quiet, not always so still. There was a time when this house was full of laughter, and he was at the center of it.
And the tea?
Clara asked. Does it have something to do with her? Henry looked at her for a long moment, and then he simply shook his head, not in denial, but in the way of a man who had said as much as he was willing to say for one night. Ask him yourself, someday, Henry said, rising slowly from his chair. When the time feels right, not before. He left the room, his footsteps slow and even, leaving Clara alone with her half-eaten bread, and a mind now racing faster than ever. She thought about Margaret's words, about patience and trust. She thought about Oliver's warning, about lines that should not be crossed. She thought about the broken teacup on the study floor, and the way the Duke had stood so still afterward, as if bracing himself against something only he could see. And she thought about the tea itself, poured fresh every single morning, left untouched every single day. Not out of carelessness, not out of forgetfulness, but out of something far deeper, something that lived in the space between grief and memory, between letting go and holding on. Clara did not know Charlotte's story yet. She did not know why the tea remained untouched, or why the portrait had vanished from the main hall, or what lay behind the locked door at the end of the quiet hallway, but she knew, with a certainty that surprised her, that these answers mattered, not for her own curiosity alone, but for the man who carried this silent weight every single morning, alone, in a house full of people who loved him enough to protect his secret, but perhaps not brave enough to help him carry it. As she climbed the stairs to her small room that night, she passed the East Wing corridor once more. The Duke's study door was closed, a thin line of candlelight flickering beneath it. She paused for just a moment, listening to the silence on the other side, before continuing on to bed. Tomorrow, she would bring the tea again, exactly at 7 o'clock. She would pour it, place it beside him, and watch him nod his small, familiar nod. But something inside her had shifted that day. The routine no longer felt like an ordinary task. It felt like the opening chapter of a much larger story, one that had been unfolding quietly within the walls of Ashcombe Hall long before she ever arrived, and one that she now found herself irresistibly drawn into. She fell asleep that night, thinking not of her chores for the following day, but of a woman named Charlotte, who once walked through gardens at dawn, and a Duke who had never quite let her go. The scream came from the garden just after dawn, sharp and sudden, cutting through the quiet morning air like a blade. Clara dropped the basket of linens she was carrying and ran toward the sound, her heart slamming against her ribs. She rounded the corner of the East Wing and found Henry, the old gardener, kneeling beside the rose bushes, his face pale, his hands trembling. "Henry, what happened?" she called out, rushing to his side. He did not answer at first. He simply pointed toward the ground, where a small stone marker lay overturned, half buried in the soil beneath the roses. Clara knelt down and brushed away the dirt, revealing faint letters carved into the stone. A name, Charlotte, and beneath it, a date, worn nearly smooth by years of rain and wind. "I did not know this was here," Clara whispered. "Nobody does," Henry said, his voice shaking. "I have tended these roses for 30 years, and never once disturbed this spot. Someone moved it, someone dug here." Clara looked around the quiet garden, the mist still clinging to the grass, the roses trembling slightly in the morning breeze. There was no one else in sight. Henry shook his head slowly, staring at the small marker, as if it might answer him directly. "I do not know, but this was placed here quietly, many years ago, without ceremony, without announcement. The Duke asked for privacy, and we gave it to him. Whoever disturbed this soil either did not know that, or did not care. Clara helped Henry set the stone marker upright again, pressing the soil firmly around its base. Her hands were shaking slightly, though she could not say whether it was from the cold morning air, or from the strange feeling settling over her, the sense that something in this quiet, careful house was beginning to shift. She said nothing to the Duke that morning, when she brought his tea at 7 o'clock. He sat in his usual chair, his eyes distant, and she poured the tea as always, careful and silent. But her mind kept returning to the small stone marker beneath the roses, and to Henry's shaking hands, and to the unspoken fear that had crossed his face. Later that afternoon, Margaret Hollis called Clara into the small office she used for managing household matters. The room was neat and orderly, shelves lined with ledgers and account books, a single window looking out over the front drive. "Henry told me what happened this morning," Margaret said, her expression serious. "I want you to understand something, Clara. What lies beneath those roses is not to be discussed with anyone outside this house, not with the tradesmen who visit, not with guests, not with anyone at all." "I would never speak of it carelessly," Clara said. "But Margaret, someone disturbed that ground. Should we not tell the Duke?" Margaret's face tightened. The Duke must not be troubled with this. Not now. Not this week of all weeks. "Because of the anniversary," Clara said quietly, remembering what Oliver had told her. Margaret's eyes flickered with surprise, then settled into something more guarded. "You have been asking questions." "I have been listening," Clara corrected gently. "The staff speak carefully, but they do speak. I know there was a woman named Charlotte. I know the Duke grieves her, even now, all these years later. I only wish to understand enough to serve him properly, without stumbling into pain I do not mean to cause." Margaret studied her for a long moment, then sighed, some of the tension leaving her shoulders. "Charlotte was his wife," she said finally. "They married young, full of joy, the kind of joy this old house had not seen in generations. She loved the mornings. She loved tea, brewed strong and black, taken out into the garden while the dew was still fresh." Clara held her breath, afraid that speaking might stop the flow of words. "She died suddenly," Margaret continued, her voice quieter now. "An illness that came fast and gave no warning. One week she was laughing in these very halls, and the next, she was gone. The Duke was not the same after that. He stopped speaking of her entirely. He asked that her portrait be moved, that her belongings be stored away, that her name never be mentioned in his presence." "And the tea?" Clara asked softly. "I do not know the full truth of it," Margaret admitted. "But this began shortly after her passing. Every morning, without fail, he asks for a cup of tea, prepared exactly as she used to prepare it for him. And every morning, he does not drink it." Clara sat in silence, absorbing the weight of this information, feeling something shift inside her chest, a tenderness she had not expected to feel so strongly for a man she barely knew. "Thank you for telling me," she said quietly. "I tell you so that you understand the delicacy required," Margaret said, "not so that you go asking him questions directly. Do you understand me, Clara?" "I understand," Clara said, though even as she spoke the words, she felt a small, quiet resistance building somewhere inside her. That evening, as she walked back toward the servants' quarters, she noticed a light flickering in the window of the Duke's study, far later than usual. Curious despite herself, she paused beneath the window, careful to stay in the shadows. Through the glass, she could see him seated at his desk, a small wooden box open in front of him. He was holding something in his hands, turning it over slowly, his shoulders hunched in a way she had never seen before. She could not tell what the object was from this distance, only that it seemed to hold enormous weight for him, judging by the stillness of his posture, and the slow, careful way he handled it. She knew she should look away. She knew this was a private moment, not meant for her eyes. But something about his expression, the raw grief written so plainly across his face, rooted her to the spot. After several long minutes, he closed the box gently and set it aside, then rose from his desk and walked toward the window. Clara stepped back quickly into the deeper shadows of the garden, her heart pounding, afraid he might have seen her. He had not. He simply stood at the window for a long moment, staring out into the darkness, before drawing the curtains closed. Clara returned to her room that night, her mind full of questions she still could not ask. and a growing tenderness for a man whose grief had shaped every quiet corner of this enormous house. The next morning, she arrived at the study exactly at 7 o'clock, tray in hand. The Duke was seated in his usual chair, though something about his posture seemed different, less guarded than usual. "You found the marker in the garden," he said, before she had even finished pouring the tea. Clara's hands stilled for a moment. "Yes, Your Grace. Henry and I set it right again." "Thank you," he said simply. She waited, unsure whether he wished to say more, but he simply nodded toward the door, the familiar dismissal. She curtsied and left, though this time, she felt something had shifted between them, some small thread of understanding, beginning to form, where before, there had only been silence and distance. Over the following days, Clara noticed small changes in the household. Margaret seemed more watchful than usual, checking on the Duke's meals, his schedule, his moods, with a care that bordered on worry. Mrs. Ellery prepared his favorite dishes without being asked, small comforts offered quietly, without announcement. Oliver moved more carefully through the halls, speaking in hushed tones, as though the entire house were holding its breath. "It happens every year around this time," Oliver explained to Clara one afternoon, as they folded linens together in the laundry room. "The staff call it the Quiet Week, though never where the Duke might hear it. We all try to make things easier for him, without ever speaking of why." "Has anyone ever asked him directly?" Clara asked. "About Charlotte, or the tea, or any of it?" Oliver shook his head firmly. "Never. Margaret would never allow it, and honestly, none of us have the courage. He is a good employer, patient and fair, but there is a wall around him that nobody dares to climb." Clara thought of the small wooden box she had seen him holding the night before, and the raw grief on his face as he turned it over in his hands. She thought of the untouched tea, cold on its tray every single morning, poured with such care, and left with such deliberate emptiness. "Do you think," she said slowly, "that someone should climb that wall eventually, not to intrude, but simply to let him know he does not have to carry it entirely alone?" Oliver looked at her carefully, a flicker of concern crossing his face. "That is a dangerous thought, Clara. Be careful where it leads you." But Clara could not shake the feeling that had been growing inside her since the morning the teacup shattered on the study floor. It was not mere curiosity anymore. It had become something closer to compassion, a quiet determination to understand, not for the sake of gossip or intrigue, but for the sake of a man who seemed to be drowning slowly in a grief nobody around him was brave enough to address. That night, unable to sleep, she rose from her bed and walked quietly through the darkened halls of Ashcombe Hall, drawn once again toward the narrow corridor that led to the locked door Margaret had warned her away from. She did not intend to open it. She only wished to stand before it, to feel whatever remained of the woman named Charlotte, whose absence had shaped this entire house so completely. As she approached, she noticed something she had not seen before, a thin line of light beneath the door, faint but unmistakable. Someone was inside. Her breath caught in her throat, and she pressed herself against the wall, listening carefully. She heard movement, slow and deliberate, and then the soft, unmistakable sound of a chair creaking, as though someone had just sat down. She should have left immediately. Every warning she had received told her to turn around and walk away, but her feet remained rooted to the spot, and after a long moment of hesitation, she found herself reaching out and knocking softly on the door. The movement inside stopped instantly. "Who is there?" a voice asked, low and unmistakable. It was the Duke. Clara's heart pounded so loudly, she was certain he could hear it through the door. She opened her mouth to answer, but no words came, and for a long, breathless moment, the two of them simply stood on opposite sides of that locked door, separated by wood and silence and years of carefully guarded grief. The door opened before Clara could decide whether to run or stay. Duke Edmund Whitmore stood in the doorway, a single candle in his hand, its flame casting long shadows across his face. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Clara felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment, certain she was about to be dismissed from her position on the spot. "Miss Bennet," he said quietly, his voice carrying none of the anger she expected. "It is rather late for you to be wandering these halls." "Forgive me, Your Grace," Clara said quickly, dropping into a curtsy. "I could not sleep, and I found myself walking, without much thought, to where I was going." He studied her for a long moment, the candlelight flickering between them, and then, to her surprise, he stepped aside slightly, allowing a narrow view into the room behind him. It was smaller than Clara expected, filled with soft furniture covered in pale fabric, a writing desk beneath the single window, and shelves lined with books that looked well read, their spines worn and familiar. On the wall above the desk hung a portrait, the very one Oliver had mentioned, the one that had been removed from the main hall years ago. Clara could not help but glance at it. The woman in the painting had warm brown eyes and a gentle smile, her dark hair pulled back loosely, a single strand falling across her cheek. She looked like someone who laughed often, who filled rooms with warmth simply by entering them. "That is Charlotte," the Duke said, following her gaze. His voice had softened, though there was a rawness beneath it that made Clara's chest tighten. "She was very beautiful," Clara said softly. "She was much more than that," he replied, looking at the portrait with an expression Clara could not quite name. Grief, certainly, but also something gentler, something that looked almost like gratitude. He gestured toward a chair near the desk, an unspoken invitation, and Clara hesitated only a moment before stepping inside and sitting down. It felt strange, being invited into this private space after weeks of careful distance, but she did not want to break whatever fragile openness had settled over him in this quiet hour. "You must think me a strange man," he said, setting the candle down on the desk and lowering himself into the chair across from her. "Ordering tea I never drink, locking myself away in rooms nobody is meant to enter." "I do not think that, Your Grace," Clara said honestly. "I only wish to understand." He was quiet for a long moment, his fingers tracing the edge of the desk absently. "Charlotte used to sit right where you are sitting now," he said finally. "Every morning, before the rest of the house woke, she would come here with 2 cups of tea, and we would talk about nothing important at all. The weather, the roses in the garden, silly things that meant nothing and everything all at once." Clara remained silent, sensing that he needed the space to continue without interruption. "When she died," he continued, his voice growing quieter, "I could not bear to change anything. Not the tea, not this room, not even the way she used to pour it. Always a little too much sugar, always insisting the pot needed 1 more minute to steep properly. If I let it go, it felt as though I was letting her go entirely, as though the world would simply move on without her, as though her absence would become ordinary." "So you keep the tea," Clara said softly, understanding beginning to bloom in her chest. "Not because you believe she will drink it, but because making it keeps her close." He looked at her then, truly looking at her for the first time since she had arrived at Ashcombe Hall weeks ago, his eyes tired, but no longer entirely guarded. "Yes," he said simply, "that is exactly it." They sat together in silence for a long moment, the candle flickering between them, the portrait of Charlotte watching over the room with her warm, painted smile. "Does it help?" Clara asked gently, "keeping the ritual alive?" The Duke considered the question carefully before answering. "For a long time, I believed it did, but lately, I have begun to wonder if I am only keeping myself trapped in a moment that has long since passed. The tea grows cold every single morning, and every single morning, I let it. Perhaps that says more about me than I would like to admit." Clara's heart ached at the honesty in his voice, the vulnerability he had allowed her to witness. She thought carefully before speaking again, aware that whatever she said next mattered deeply. "Your Grace, I do not believe grief has a proper timeline that anyone must follow. But I also do not believe that holding on to a ritual means you cannot also begin to heal. Perhaps the tea does not need to be about choosing between remembering her and moving forward. Perhaps it can simply be about honoring her, in whatever way feels right, for as long as you need it." He was quiet for a long moment, considering her words carefully. "You speak with more wisdom than most people twice your age," he said finally, a faint, tired smile touching the corner of his mouth. "I have lost people too, Your Grace," Clara admitted. "My mother, when I was young. I understand, perhaps only in a small way, what it means to hold on to small things, because letting them go feels impossible." He nodded slowly, something shifting in his expression, a recognition passing between them that went beyond the usual boundaries of employer and servant. "I should not keep you from your rest any longer," he said finally, rising from his chair. "Thank you, Miss Bennet, for your honesty tonight." "Thank you for yours, Your Grace," Clara replied, rising as well. As she reached the door, she paused and turned back toward him. For what it is worth, I think Charlotte would be glad to know how deeply she is still loved, even now. He did not answer immediately, but she saw his eyes glisten faintly in the candlelight, and she understood that her words had landed exactly where they needed to. She left the room quietly, closing the door behind her, and made her way back through the dark corridors toward her own quarters, her mind spinning with everything she had learned and everything she had said. She wondered if she had overstepped, if tomorrow morning would bring consequences for her boldness. But beneath that worry was something steadier, a quiet certainty that she had done the right thing by speaking honestly, by offering comfort rather than distance. The next morning, Clara approached the study with the tea tray, her hands slightly unsteady, unsure of what to expect after the intimacy of the previous night's conversation. She knocked twice, as always, and entered when she heard his voice. The Duke was seated in his usual chair, though something about his posture seemed lighter than she had ever seen before. He looked up as she entered, and for the first time since she had begun working at Ashcombe Hall, he offered her something more than a small nod. He offered a genuine, if tired, smile. "Good morning, Miss Bennet," he said. "Good morning, Your Grace," she replied, setting down the tray and pouring the tea with the same careful attention she always gave it. As she placed the cup beside him, she noticed something different in his expression, a thoughtfulness that had not been there before. He looked at the cup for a long moment, longer than usual, his fingers resting near the handle without quite touching it. "Miss Bennet," he said, before she could turn to leave. "Yes, Your Grace?" "Thank you for the tea," he said. "It smells particularly good this morning." It was such a simple thing to say, and yet Clara felt the weight of it settle over her. A small but significant shift in the careful choreography they had performed every single morning for weeks. She curtsied and left the room, her heart lighter than it had been in days, carrying with her the quiet, growing hope that perhaps, slowly, something was beginning to change within the walls of Ashcombe Hall. Word of the previous night's conversation never spread among the staff, as Clara kept it carefully to herself, understanding instinctively that this fragile moment of openness between herself and the Duke was not meant for gossip or speculation, but something had shifted in the atmosphere of the house nonetheless, a subtle lightness that even Margaret and Oliver seemed to notice, though neither of them understood its source. "You seem different today," Oliver observed as they worked together in the pantry that afternoon. "Lighter somehow." "Do I?" Clara said, unable to keep a small smile from tugging at her lips. "You do," Oliver said, studying her carefully. "Did something happen?" "Nothing worth mentioning," Clara said, though the warmth in her chest told a different story entirely. Over the following days, small changes continued to unfold. The Duke began taking his meals in the main dining room again, rather than alone in his study, as had become his habit in recent months. He spoke more frequently with the staff, asking after their families, their well-being, small kindnesses that had once been common before Charlotte's passing, but had grown rare in the years since. Clara continued bringing his tea every morning at 7 o'clock, and though he still did not drink it, their brief exchanges grew warmer, more comfortable, filled with small observations about the weather, or the garden, or the books scattered across his desk. It was not a dramatic transformation, nothing so sudden or obvious that the rest of the household might remark upon it directly, but Clara could feel it nonetheless, a slow thawing of something that had been frozen for a very long time. One morning, nearly a week after their conversation in the locked room, the Duke looked up from his book as Clara entered with the tray. "Miss Bennet," he said, "would you care to join me for a moment, once you have poured the tea?" Clara blinked in surprise. "Join you, Your Grace?" "Only for a few minutes," he said, gesturing toward the chair across from his own. "I find I have grown rather tired of drinking my morning tea in complete silence." Clara set down the tray carefully, poured his tea as always, and then, with a small, uncertain smile, took the seat he had offered, unsure of where this new chapter between them might lead, but hopeful, for the first time in a long while, that it might lead somewhere good. A carriage arrived at Ashcombe Hall, without warning, its wheels crushing gravel too fast, too urgent, for an ordinary visit. Clara was in the front hall, arranging fresh flowers, when she heard the commotion outside, voices raised, boots hurrying across stone. She set down the vase and hurried to the window, watching as a tall woman in a dark green traveling coat stepped down from the carriage, her expression sharp and impatient. "Who is that?" Clara asked Oliver, who had appeared beside her, his face suddenly pale. "That," Oliver said quietly, "is Lady Constance Ainsley, the Duke's cousin. Is that a problem?" Oliver did not answer immediately, his eyes fixed on the woman as she strode toward the front doors, her sharp heels clicking against the stone steps. "She has not visited Ashcombe Hall in nearly 3 years," he said finally. "Not since shortly after Charlotte's passing. There was talk, back then, of disagreements between her and the Duke. Nobody below stairs knows the full details, but it was not a peaceful parting." Margaret Hollis appeared at the front door just in time to greet Lady Constance, her expression carefully composed, though Clara could see the tension in her shoulders. "Lady Ainsley," Margaret said, her voice polite but guarded, "we were not informed of your visit." "I did not think it necessary to announce myself to my own family's household," Lady Constance replied coolly, sweeping past Margaret into the front hall without waiting for an invitation. "Where is my cousin?" "His Grace is currently occupied with estate matters," Margaret said. "If you would care to wait in the drawing room, I will inform him of your arrival." Lady Constance's sharp eyes swept across the hall, landing briefly on Clara, who quickly lowered her gaze and returned to arranging the flowers, though her ears remained keenly attuned to every word being spoken. "Very well," Lady Constance said finally, "but do not keep me waiting long. I have traveled a great distance, and I intend to speak with Edmund before the day is through." She swept into the drawing room, and Margaret hurried away to inform the Duke, her expression tight with concern. "This cannot be good," Oliver murmured to Clara once the hall had emptied. "Lady Constance never visits without a reason, and her reasons are rarely pleasant." Clara felt a knot forming in her stomach, an instinctive worry for the fragile progress she had witnessed over the past week, the small warmth beginning to return to the Duke's manner, the gentle conversations shared over untouched tea. She feared, without quite knowing why, that this unexpected visitor threatened to undo all of it. She did not have long to wait before learning more. Within the hour, raised voices could be heard from behind the closed doors of the drawing room, though the words themselves remained muffled and indistinct. Clara found herself lingering near the hallway, on the pretense of dusting the side tables, straining to catch fragments of the conversation. "Cannot continue living like this, Edmund," Lady Constance's voice, sharp and insistent. "Not your concern how I choose to grieve." The Duke's voice, tighter than Clara had ever heard it. "The estate, the title, your responsibilities." Lady Constance again, her tone growing more forceful. "I have managed perfectly well without your interference for 3 years." The conversation continued in this manner for some time, rising and falling in intensity, until finally the drawing room door opened and Lady Constance emerged, her face flushed with anger, her sharp eyes sweeping across the hall until they landed once again on Clara. "You," Lady Constance said, striding toward her, "you are new here." Clara straightened immediately, dropping into a respectful curtsy. "Yes, my lady. Clara Bennet." Lady Constance studied her with an expression Clara could not quite read, something between suspicion and calculation. "You bring my cousin his morning tea, do you not?" "I do, my lady." "And has he been drinking it?" Lady Constance asked, her voice sharpening further. Clara hesitated, uncertain how to answer such a pointed question. "I could not say, my lady. That is not something I would presume to comment upon." Lady Constance's eyes narrowed slightly, but she said nothing further, simply sweeping past Clara toward the front doors, calling for her carriage to be readied. Within minutes, she was gone, the gravel crunching once again beneath urgent wheels as her carriage disappeared down the long drive. Clara found the Duke later that afternoon, seated once again in his study, though this time his posture had returned to the guarded stillness she remembered from her very first weeks at Ashcombe Hall. The warmth of the previous days seemed to have evaporated entirely, replaced by something heavier, more troubled. "Your Grace," she said softly, entering with a fresh pot of tea, though it was well past the usual morning hour. "I thought you might like something warm, given the difficult afternoon." He looked up at her, and for a moment, she saw something raw and unguarded in his expression before he composed himself once again. "Thank you, Miss Bennet, that is thoughtful of you." She poured the tea and set it beside him, then hesitated, uncertain whether to leave or remain. "You may stay, if you wish," he said quietly, seeming to sense her hesitation. Clara took the seat across from him, the same seat she had occupied several times over the past week during their brief morning conversations. "Lady Constance believes I am wasting my life away in grief," he said finally, his voice heavy with exhaustion. "She believes the estate requires a stronger hand, one not so consumed by memories of the past. She has suggested, not for the first time, that I should remarry, that a new wife might restore proper order to this household." Clara's chest tightened at the bluntness of this revelation, though she said nothing, sensing that he needed simply to speak, rather than to be answered. "She means well, in her own way," he continued. "She worries for the estate, for the tenants, who depend upon its proper management, for the family name that has endured for generations. But she does not understand that grief cannot simply be set aside because it becomes inconvenient." "No one can dictate how long grief should last, Your Grace," Clara said gently, "least of all someone who has not walked the same path." He looked at her then, something grateful flickering across his tired features. "You understand that better than most who share my blood, it seems." They sat together in comfortable silence for a moment, the tea steaming gently between them, untouched as always, though the Duke's fingers rested near the cup with what seemed like genuine consideration. "She is not entirely wrong, however," he admitted after a long pause. "The estate does require attention. I have not always given it. There are decisions pending, arrangements that cannot wait indefinitely. Perhaps it is time I began stepping more fully back into the responsibilities I have avoided since Charlotte's passing." "That does not mean forgetting her," Clara said carefully. "It simply means finding a way to carry her memory, while still moving forward with your life." He nodded slowly, considering her words with the same thoughtful seriousness he had shown during their late-night conversation in the locked room. "You have a way of making difficult truths feel more bearable, Miss Bennet." Clara felt her cheeks warm slightly at the compliment, though she quickly composed herself, aware of the boundaries that still existed between them, despite the growing warmth of their exchanges. Over dinner that evening in the servants' hall, the staff spoke in hushed, anxious tones about Lady Constance's visit and its implications. "She has always wanted more control over the estate," Margaret said quietly, stirring her soup without much appetite. "Since Charlotte passed, she has pushed relentlessly for the Duke to remarry, believing a new Duchess would settle matters more firmly in her favor." "Do you think he will listen to her?" Oliver asked. Margaret shook her head firmly. "The Duke has never been one to bow easily to pressure, especially not from Lady Constance. But her words do carry weight, even when he refuses to admit it. She is not entirely wrong about the estate's needs, whatever her true motivations may be." Clara listened carefully to this exchange, her mind returning again and again to the Duke's words in the study that afternoon, his admission that perhaps it was time to step more fully back into his responsibilities. She wondered what this might mean for the fragile progress they had built together over the past week, the small moments of warmth and honesty that had begun to bridge the distance between them. That night, as she prepared for bed, Clara found herself reflecting on everything she had witnessed since arriving at Ashcombe Hall: the broken teacup on the study floor, the stone marker hidden beneath the roses, the locked room with its portrait of a woman whose absence still shaped every corner of this grand old house, and now, the sharp intrusion of Lady Constance, threatening to disrupt the careful, quiet healing that had only just begun. She did not know what the coming days would bring, whether the Duke would retreat further into his grief, or whether he might find the courage to step forward into whatever new chapter awaited him. But she knew, with growing certainty, that she wanted to be there to witness whichever path he chose, offering whatever quiet support she could provide along the way. As she drifted toward sleep, her thoughts lingered on the image of the Duke's fingers resting near his untouched teacup, closer than she had ever seen them before, as though some invisible barrier were slowly, gradually, beginning to soften. A letter arrived that changed everything, sealed with wax and addressed in handwriting Clara did not recognize. She found it while sorting the Morning Post in the front hall, tucked among ordinary correspondence from tenants and merchants. This one, however, bore a different weight entirely, the paper thick and expensive, the seal pressed with a crest Clara had never seen before at Ashcombe Hall. "This one is addressed directly to the Duke," she said to Margaret, who was passing through the hall with a stack of linens. "It looks important." Margaret took the letter and examined the seal carefully, her brow furrowing. This is Lady Constance's family crest, though it is not her handwriting. This must be from her husband, Lord Ainsley. Should I deliver it to the Duke now? Clara asked. Margaret hesitated, glancing toward the study door. Best to wait until his morning tea. He prefers not to be disturbed with correspondence before then. Clara nodded and set the letter aside carefully, though her curiosity burned at the mystery of its contents. She spent the remainder of the morning attending to her usual duties, though her mind kept returning to the sealed letter and what news it might carry. At 7 o'clock, she carried the tray to the Duke's study as always, the letter resting beside the teapot. He looked up as she entered, offering the small, tired smile that had become familiar over the past week, though something in his expression suggested the strain of yesterday's confrontation with Lady Constance still lingered. "Good morning, Miss Bennet," he said. "You seem troubled." "There is a letter for you, Your Grace," Clara said, setting the tray down carefully. "From Lord Ainsley, I believe." The Duke's expression shifted immediately, the warmth fading into something more guarded. He took the letter from the tray, examining the seal with narrowed eyes, before breaking it open and reading the contents in silence. Clara poured his tea and stepped back, watching as his expression darkened with each passing line, his jaw tightening, his hands gripping the paper more firmly. "Is everything well, Your Grace?" she asked cautiously. He did not answer immediately, finishing the letter before setting it down on the desk with more force than necessary. "Lord Ainsley writes on behalf of Lady Constance," he said finally, his voice tight with barely controlled frustration. "It seems my cousin has decided to take matters into her own hands." "What do you mean, Your Grace?" "She has arranged for potential brides to be presented to me," he said, his voice heavy with disbelief. "A series of introductions, carefully orchestrated, beginning next month. She claims this is for the good of the estate, that I have grieved long enough, that it is time I fulfilled my duty to secure the family line." Clara felt a strange tightness in her chest at this news, though she could not quite name the emotion behind it. "That seems rather forward of her, Your Grace, without your consent." "It is entirely like her," he said, running a hand through his hair in obvious frustration. "She has never respected boundaries when she believes she knows better than everyone around her." "Will you refuse?" Clara asked. He was quiet for a long moment, staring down at the letter, as though it might offer some answer beyond its actual words. "I do not know," he admitted finally. "Part of me wishes to refuse outright, to send back a firm and immediate rejection. But another part of me wonders if she is not entirely wrong. The estate does need an heir eventually. My duty to this family name cannot remain suspended indefinitely, simply because I have not yet found the strength to move forward." Clara felt her chest tighten further at these words, though she reminded herself firmly that such matters were far beyond her place to comment upon directly. "That is a decision only you can make, Your Grace," she said carefully. "But I hope, whatever you decide, it comes from your own heart, and not merely from pressure placed upon you by others." He looked up at her then, something thoughtful in his gaze. "You always seem to know precisely the right thing to say, Miss Bennet." "I only speak honestly, Your Grace," she replied, though her cheeks warmed slightly under his attention. He set the letter aside and reached for his tea, his fingers wrapping fully around the cup for the first time Clara had ever witnessed. He did not drink it, not yet, but the gesture itself felt significant, a small crack in the armor of ritual he had maintained so faithfully for years. "I must give this matter serious thought," he said, more to himself than to her. "Perhaps it is time I stopped hiding from decisions I have long avoided." Clara curtsied and left the study, her mind spinning with everything she had just witnessed. The thought of the Duke entertaining potential brides filled her with an unexpected ache, one she quickly attempted to suppress, reminding herself firmly of her place within this household, and the impropriety of any feelings beyond simple loyalty and care for her employer's well-being. Over the following days, word of Lady Constance's arrangements spread quietly among the staff, sparking hushed conversations in the servants' hall. "Do you think he will actually go through with it?" Oliver asked one evening, as he and Clara worked together, polishing the silver for an upcoming dinner. "I do not know," Clara admitted. He seemed uncertain himself. "It would be good for the estate," Margaret said, joining their conversation as she passed through with a stack of freshly pressed linens. "Whatever we may think of Lady Constance's methods, she is not wrong about the necessity of an heir. The Duke cannot mourn forever, however much we might sympathize with his grief." Clara said nothing, though inwardly, she wrestled with conflicting emotions she did not fully understand. She told herself firmly that her concern was simply for the Duke's happiness, for his ability to heal properly, rather than being pushed into decisions before he was truly ready. But beneath that concern lingered something else entirely, something she was not yet prepared to examine too closely. A week later, the first of Lady Constance's arranged introductions arrived at Ashcombe Hall. Miss Beatrice Langley, the daughter of a wealthy merchant family, arrived with her parents for an afternoon visit, dressed elegantly, her manner polished and confident. Clara observed from a respectful distance as the young woman was introduced to the Duke in the drawing room, her laughter light and practiced, her conversation carefully calculated to charm and impress. The Duke responded with polite courtesy, though Clara noticed the careful distance he maintained throughout the visit, a formality that suggested obligation rather than genuine interest. After the Langleys departed, Clara brought a fresh pot of tea to the study, finding the Duke seated in his usual chair, though his expression carried a weariness that had not been present before the visit. "How was your afternoon, Your Grace?" she asked carefully, setting down the tray. "Exhausting," he admitted, rubbing his temples. "Miss Langley is perfectly pleasant, I am sure, but the entire arrangement feels artificial, like performing a role in a play I never agreed to act in." "Perhaps it simply requires more time," Clara offered gently. "Finding genuine connection cannot be rushed, even under such deliberate circumstances." He looked at her carefully, something searching in his gaze. "Do you believe genuine connection is even possible, arranged in such a manner?" Clara hesitated, unsure how to answer such a direct question, without overstepping the boundaries she had promised herself to maintain. "I believe," she said finally, choosing her words with care, "that genuine connection often arrives unexpectedly, in quiet moments, rather than grand introductions. Perhaps it cannot be forced into existence simply through careful arrangement." He nodded slowly, his eyes lingering on her for a moment longer than necessary, before he looked away, back toward the fire crackling gently in the hearth. "You may be right, Miss Bennet," he said quietly, "though I fear my cousin will not be so easily convinced." Over the following weeks, more introductions followed, each young woman polished and accomplished, each visit conducted with the same careful formality Clara had witnessed with Miss Langley. And after each visit, the Duke retreated to his study, his weariness growing more pronounced, his conversations with Clara during their morning tea becoming, if anything, more honest and unguarded, as though she alone offered him respite from the exhausting performance Lady Constance had orchestrated. "I do not know how much longer I can continue this charade," he admitted to her one morning, several weeks into the arrangement. "Each young woman is perfectly suitable in her own way, and yet none of them feel right. I find myself comparing every conversation, every laugh, every small gesture, against memories I have carried for years, memories that no arranged introduction could ever hope to match." Clara's heart ached at the raw honesty in his voice, though she said nothing, understanding that he needed simply to speak these thoughts aloud, rather than receive any particular response. "Perhaps," he continued, almost to himself, "I have been looking for something that arranged introductions were never designed to provide. Perhaps genuine connection, as you said, arrives unexpectedly, in quiet moments, rather than grand performances." He looked at her then, something unspoken passing between them, a recognition that neither of them was quite ready to name directly. Clara felt her heart quicken, though she quickly reminded herself of the impropriety of such feelings, the vast distance that still separated a duke from a servant girl, however genuine their conversations had become. "I should return to my duties, Your Grace," she said softly, curtsying and turning toward the door, though she could feel his eyes following her as she left the room. Outside in the corridor, she paused for a moment, her heart pounding with feelings she could not fully name or understand, feelings that felt both wonderful and deeply dangerous in equal measure. Fire raced across the eastern rooftop just before midnight, and Clara woke to the sound of shouting echoing through the halls of Ashcombe Hall. She scrambled from her bed, pulling a shawl around her shoulders, and rushed into the corridor, where other servants were already running toward the source of the commotion. Through a narrow window, she could see an orange glow flickering against the night sky, smoke curling upward from somewhere near the old east wing. "The archive room," Oliver shouted, appearing beside her, his face pale with alarm. "The old records are stored there, along with some of the family's private papers." Clara's stomach dropped as she realized the archive room sat just beyond the narrow hallway that led to Charlotte's locked sitting room, the very room where she and the Duke had spoken so openly weeks before. They joined the chain of servants, passing buckets of water toward the growing blaze, the heat intense even from a distance, sparks drifting upward into the darkness like dying stars. Henry directed the effort with surprising calm, shouting instructions, organizing the frantic staff into some semblance of order. "Where is the Duke?" Clara asked, scanning the chaotic scene for his familiar figure. "He went in," Oliver said grimly, pointing toward the smoke-filled entrance to the east wing. "Something about important papers he refused to leave behind." Clara's heart lurched with fear. "He went inside the burning building." "Margaret tried to stop him," Oliver said, but he would not listen. Without thinking, Clara pushed past the line of servants and ran toward the entrance, ignoring Oliver's shouted warning behind her. The heat struck her like a physical wall as she approached, smoke stinging her eyes, but she pressed forward, calling out the Duke's name into the swirling darkness. "Your Grace!" she shouted, coughing against the smoke. "Your Grace, please, you must come out." She found him near the entrance to the narrow hallway, coughing violently, a small wooden box clutched tightly against his chest, the same box she had seen him holding weeks before through the study window. "You should not be in here," he gasped, his eyes red from smoke, though his grip on the box remained fierce and unyielding. "Neither should you," Clara replied, grabbing his arm firmly. "Please, Your Grace, we must leave immediately." He hesitated for only a moment, glancing back toward the hallway where Charlotte's locked room stood, flames already licking dangerously close to the old wooden door. "There is nothing more valuable in there than your own life," Clara said urgently, pulling him toward the exit, with as much strength as she could manage. "Please, come with me now." Something in her voice seemed to break through his hesitation, and he allowed her to guide him back through the smoke-filled corridor, out into the cool night air, where Margaret and Oliver rushed forward immediately, relief flooding their faces. "Your Grace, thank heavens," Margaret said, her voice shaking with emotion. Clara had never before witnessed from the normally composed housekeeper. "We feared the worst." The Duke collapsed onto a nearby bench, coughing heavily, still clutching the small wooden box against his chest, with white-knuckled determination. Clara knelt beside him, checking carefully for injuries, relieved to find nothing beyond smoke inhalation and a few minor burns along his forearms. "You foolish, foolish man," Margaret scolded gently, though her voice trembled with obvious affection and worry. "What could possibly be worth risking your life for?" The Duke opened the box slowly, revealing its contents to the small group gathered around him. Inside lay a collection of letters, tied together with faded ribbon, along with a small silver locket that caught the moonlight with a gentle gleam. "Charlotte's letters," he said quietly, his voice still rough from smoke. "And her locket. I could not bear the thought of losing the last physical pieces of her that remain." Clara felt tears prick at her own eyes, moved by the depth of devotion this simple wooden box represented, years of careful preservation, of holding on to fragments of a love that time and grief had not managed to diminish. By the time the fire brigade arrived from the nearby village, the flames had spread further than anyone anticipated, consuming a significant portion of the east wing, including, Clara realized with a sinking heart, the narrow hallway that led to Charlotte's sitting room. They worked through the remainder of the night, battling the blaze, until finally, as dawn began to break across the horizon, the last of the flames were extinguished, leaving behind a smoldering ruin where the archive room and surrounding chambers had once stood. Exhausted and covered in soot, the household staff gathered in the main hall as the sun rose, assessing the damage and comforting one another after the terrifying ordeal. The Duke sat quietly among them, still holding tightly to the small wooden box, his expression a mixture of grief and profound relief. "The room is gone," he said quietly, staring toward the ruined east wing, visible through the tall windows. "Charlotte's sitting room, her portrait, everything I preserved so carefully all these years." Clara sat beside him, exhaustion weighing heavily on her own limbs, though her heart ached more for his loss than her own physical fatigue.
"I am so deeply sorry, Your Grace."
He was quiet for a long moment, staring at the box in his hands. "And yet," he said finally, his voice carrying an unexpected note of clarity, "I still have this. The letters. the locket. The most important pieces of her memory survived, even as the room itself did not. Clara watched him carefully, sensing something shifting within him, some profound realization taking shape amid the wreckage of the fire. Perhaps, he continued slowly, I do not need an entire room dedicated to preserving her memory. Perhaps what truly matters was never the walls or the furniture, or even the portrait, but these small, precious things I hold in my own hands, and the memories I carry within myself, memories that no fire could ever destroy. Clara felt a profound tenderness swell within her chest at these words, recognizing the significance of this moment, this quiet turning point amid the smoke and ashes of the previous night. Perhaps, she agreed softly, this terrible loss might also become a strange kind of gift, allowing you to carry her memory forward with you, rather than leaving it locked away in a room nobody else was ever permitted to enter. He looked at her then, exhaustion and grief mingling with something gentler, something that looked remarkably like gratitude and, perhaps, the first tentative stirrings of hope. You have a remarkable way of finding light within darkness, Miss Bennet, he said quietly. I only speak what I observe, Your Grace, she replied, though her heart pounded at the warmth in his gaze. Over the following days, as the household began the slow process of rebuilding and repair, Clara noticed a marked change in the Duke's demeanor. He spent less time isolated in his study and more time among the staff, overseeing the restoration efforts personally, offering words of encouragement and gratitude to everyone who had helped battle the flames that terrible night. Lady Constance, upon hearing news of the fire, sent a brief letter expressing relief at her cousin's safety, though she did not visit in person, much to the quiet relief of the household staff still recovering from the ordeal. The morning tea ritual continued as always, Clara arriving precisely at 7 o'clock with the familiar tray, though something had shifted subtly in the atmosphere surrounding this daily routine. The Duke seemed less burdened somehow, as though the fire had, in some strange and painful way, lifted a weight he had carried for years, without realizing its full extent. I have been thinking, he said one morning, as Clara poured his tea, about what you said, regarding memory and moving forward, without abandoning the past entirely. Yes, Your Grace? I believe I am ready to make some changes, he continued, his voice steady with newfound resolve. Not to forget Charlotte, never that, but to stop allowing my grief to keep me frozen so completely in the past. Perhaps it is time I began truly living again, carrying her memory with me rather than remaining trapped within it. Clara felt her heart swell with quiet joy at these words, recognizing the profound courage required for such a declaration. I believe that would honor her memory beautifully, Your Grace, she said softly. He looked at her then, something warm and unguarded in his expression, and for a moment neither of them spoke, simply sharing the quiet significance of this turning point together, amid the lingering scent of smoke that still clung faintly to the restored halls of Ashcombe Hall. A single sheet of paper, folded and unsigned, appeared beneath Clara's door sometime during the night, and its message sent a chill straight through her chest. She found it in the early morning, just before dawn, as she prepared to begin her daily duties. The handwriting was unfamiliar, hurried, almost frantic in its uneven strokes. She unfolded it carefully, her eyes scanning the brief message written across the page. Leave Ashcombe Hall before you find yourself unwelcome. Some doors are locked for good reason, and some questions bring only ruin to those who ask them. Clara's hands trembled slightly as she read the words a second time, searching for any indication of who might have left such a message. There was no signature, no identifying mark beyond the plain paper and hurried script. She considered showing the note to Margaret immediately, but hesitated, uncertain whether doing so might create unnecessary alarm within the household, especially so soon after the trauma of the fire. Instead, she tucked the note into her apron pocket and proceeded with her morning duties, though her mind remained troubled throughout the day. At 7 o'clock, she carried the tea tray to the Duke's study as always, though her hands felt less steady than usual as she poured his tea. He noticed immediately, his sharp eyes catching the subtle tremor in her movements. Miss Bennet, is something troubling you this morning? He asked, setting aside the papers he had been reviewing. Clara hesitated, uncertain whether to share the anonymous note or keep it private, but something in his concerned expression convinced her that honesty was the better path. "I received this last night, Your Grace," she said, retrieving the folded paper from her apron pocket and handing it to him. "Slipped beneath my door, without any signature." He read the note quickly, his expression darkening with each word. "This is unacceptable," he said firmly, setting the paper down with obvious anger. "Someone within this household, or perhaps someone with access to it, has threatened you directly." "I do not wish to cause unnecessary alarm, Your Grace," Clara said quickly. "Perhaps it is simply someone's poor attempt at a jest." "This is no jest," he said, his voice carrying an authority Clara had not heard from him before. "This is a genuine threat, and I intend to discover who is responsible." He called for Margaret immediately, and within minutes, the housekeeper arrived, her expression grave as she read the anonymous note herself. "Have you noticed anything unusual recently, Margaret?" the Duke asked. "Any strange behavior among the staff, or any indication that someone might wish Miss Bennet harm?" Margaret considered the question carefully before answering. "There have been whispers, Your Grace, though I dismiss them as ordinary gossip. Some among the staff have noticed the change in your demeanor since Miss Bennet's arrival, the increased warmth, the more frequent conversations during her morning duties." "You believe someone is jealous of this friendship?" the Duke asked, his brow furrowing with confusion and concern. "Perhaps," Margaret said carefully, "or perhaps someone fears what such a friendship might mean for their own position within this household, should circumstances continue to evolve in unexpected directions." Clara felt a fresh wave of anxiety at this suggestion, uncertain who among the staff might harbor such resentment toward her, or what lengths they might go to protect whatever interests they believed were threatened. Over the following days, the Duke insisted on additional precautions, asking Oliver to keep a watchful eye on Clara's movements throughout the house, and instructing Margaret to investigate quietly among the staff for any further clues regarding the note's origin. Clara herself remained vigilant, though she tried not to let fear consume her daily duties entirely. She continued bringing the morning tea at 7 o'clock, continued her brief conversations with the Duke, though an undercurrent of unease now colored these interactions with a new tension, neither of them fully addressed. 3 days after receiving the anonymous note, Clara noticed something peculiar while cleaning the small sitting room that had been temporarily established for the Duke's use, following the fire's destruction of his previous private quarters. A drawer, usually locked, stood slightly ajar, its contents disturbed as though someone had searched through them hastily. She reported this immediately to Margaret, who arrived swiftly to investigate alongside the Duke. "Someone has been through my private correspondence," the Duke said grimly, examining the disturbed papers within the drawer. Letters regarding estate matters, personal correspondence with Lord Ainsley, even some papers relating to Charlotte's final arrangements years ago. "Is anything missing, Your Grace?" Margaret asked. He examined the contents carefully before shaking his head. "Nothing appears to be missing, though everything has clearly been disturbed, searched through with obvious urgency." "Perhaps whoever left the note fears something within these papers," Clara suggested carefully. "Something that might expose their identity, or their motives." The Duke considered this possibility seriously, his expression thoughtful. "I believe you may be right, Miss Bennet. Someone within this household harbors secrets they fear might be exposed, and they believe, mistakenly or not, that you pose a threat to those secrets." That evening, as Clara prepared for bed, Oliver approached her privately in the servants' corridor, his expression troubled. "I have been watching carefully, as the Duke asked," he said quietly, glancing around to ensure they were not overheard. "I noticed something peculiar today. One of the newer footmen, a man named Gregory who joined the staff only a few months before you arrived, has been asking unusual questions about your background, your family, your reasons for seeking employment here." Clara felt a chill run through her at this revelation. Why would he take such interest in my background? "I do not know," Oliver admitted, "but it struck me as strange, particularly given the timing of the anonymous note." Clara resolved to mention this information to the Duke immediately, and the following morning, during their usual tea, she relayed Oliver's observations carefully. The Duke listened with growing concern, his expression hardening with each detail. "I shall speak with Gregory directly," he said firmly. "If he harbors any ill intentions toward you, Miss Bennet, I will not tolerate his continued presence within this household." That afternoon, the Duke called Gregory into his study for a private conversation, the details of which Clara never learned directly. though she noticed Gregory's demeanor afterward, pale and visibly shaken, as he quietly gathered his belongings and departed Ashcombe Hall before nightfall, offering no explanation to the remaining staff regarding his sudden departure. "What did you discover, Your Grace?" Clara asked the following morning, as she poured his tea with hands that finally felt steady again. The Duke hesitated before answering, choosing his words carefully. Gregory admitted to writing the note, though his motives were more complicated than simple jealousy or malice. "It seems he had been secretly employed by Lady Constance, tasked with monitoring my activities and reporting back any information she might use to further her own agenda regarding my remarriage." Clara's eyes widened with surprise at this revelation. "Lady Constance arranged for someone to spy upon you, Your Grace?" "It appears so," he said grimly. She grew concerned, it seems, by the increasing warmth of our friendship, fearing perhaps that such closeness might interfere with her carefully orchestrated plans for my remarriage to someone more suitably matched to my station. Clara felt a complicated mixture of anger and vindication at this explanation, relieved that the threat had not stemmed from any genuine malice toward her personally, yet troubled by the extent of Lady Constance's interference in matters that seemed increasingly personal and private. "I am deeply sorry you were subjected to such distress, Miss Bennet," the Duke said, his expression sincere and apologetic. "This should never have happened, and I intend to address my cousin's interference directly and firmly." "Thank you, Your Grace," Clara said softly, moved by his obvious concern for her well-being. "I confess, I am relieved to understand the truth behind such a frightening message." He looked at her then, something warm and protective in his gaze that went beyond the usual boundaries of employer and servant. "I find myself increasingly unwilling to allow anyone, family included, to threaten your safety or peace of mind. Within these walls, Miss Bennet." Clara felt her heart quicken at these words, recognizing the depth of feeling behind them, though neither of them spoke directly of whatever unspoken connection continued to grow steadily between them, hidden beneath the careful formality of their daily routine. That evening, Clara wrote a brief letter to Lady Constance's household, informing them diplomatically through Margaret's careful guidance that such interference would no longer be tolerated within Ashcombe Hall. Whether Lady Constance would respect this boundary remained uncertain, but for the moment, at least, Clara felt a measure of peace return to the household, along with a growing awareness that whatever connection existed between herself and the Duke had grown too significant to remain entirely unspoken for much longer. Rain hammered against the windows of Ashcombe Hall the morning Clara finally found the courage to ask the question that had lingered in her heart since her very first week of service. She had brought the tea tray as always, precisely at 7 o'clock, though the storm outside cast the study in a dimmer light than usual, shadows pooling in the corners of the room, while lightning flickered occasionally beyond the tall windows. The Duke sat in his usual chair, though his expression seemed particularly distant that morning, his thoughts clearly elsewhere. Clara poured the tea carefully, setting the cup beside him as always, and then, rather than retreating immediately as her routine dictated, she remained standing near the small table, gathering her courage. "Your Grace," she said quietly, "may I ask you something rather personal?" He looked up at her, surprise flickering across his features, though he nodded slowly. "Of course, Miss Bennet. After everything we have shared these past weeks, I believe you have earned the right to ask me nearly anything." Clara took a steadying breath, aware that this moment had been building since the very first morning she had watched him stare at an untouched cup of tea, wondering silently about the story behind such a strange and consistent ritual. "Why do you never drink your tea?" she asked softly. "Not truly. I understand. It began as a way to honor Charlotte's memory, to keep her close through this small ritual. But there is something more, is there not? Something deeper, that keeps you from ever lifting that cup to your lips." The Duke's expression shifted, something raw and vulnerable crossing his features as he set down the papers he had been holding. For a long moment, he said nothing, simply staring at the untouched cup of tea beside him, steam rising gently from its surface. "You are perceptive, Miss Bennet," he said finally, his voice heavy with emotion. "There is indeed something more." Clara remained silent, sensing that he needed time to gather his own courage before continuing. "The morning Charlotte died," he began slowly, his voice trembling slightly, "we had argued. A foolish, meaningless disagreement about nothing of any real consequence. The kind of small quarrel that happens between two people who love each other deeply, but occasionally lose patience with life's minor frustrations. Clara's heart ached at the pain evident in his voice, though she remained quiet, allowing him the space to continue. She left our morning tea untouched that day, angry with me, and stormed off toward the garden alone, refusing my attempts to apologize. I told myself I would make things right later that evening, once tempers had cooled, once we both had time to reflect. I never imagined there would not be a later. His voice broke slightly, and Clara felt tears prick at her own eyes, moved deeply by the raw grief he was finally allowing himself to express. She collapsed in the garden that very afternoon, he continued, his voice barely above a whisper. The physician said it was sudden, unexpected, something no one could have predicted or prevented. But I have carried the weight of that final argument every single day since, the terrible knowledge that our last real conversation was one of anger rather than love. "Oh, Your Grace," Clara whispered, her own voice thick with emotion. "The tea," he continued, gesturing weakly toward the untouched cup beside him, "became my way of apologizing every single morning, a small penance I imposed upon myself. I order it exactly as she used to prepare it, and I leave it untouched, exactly as she left it that final morning, as though somehow, by recreating that moment precisely, I might finally find a way to make peace with what I never got to say." Clara felt tears slip down her own cheeks now, overwhelmed by the depth of guilt and love intertwined so completely within this simple, quiet ritual she had witnessed every morning, without truly understanding its full weight. "You have carried this guilt alone for years," she said softly, "believing yourself responsible for something entirely beyond your control." "How could I not?" he asked, his voice cracking with emotion. "Our final moments together were filled with anger, Miss Bennet. I never had the chance to tell her how deeply I loved her, how sorry I truly was, how our foolish argument meant nothing compared to the depth of what we shared together." Clara moved closer, kneeling beside his chair, taking his hand gently within her own, an action that crossed every boundary of propriety she had maintained throughout her service, though in this moment, she could not bring herself to care about such distinctions. "Charlotte knew you loved her," she said firmly, looking directly into his tear-filled eyes. "No single argument, however painful, could erase years of genuine love and partnership between you. She would not want you carrying this guilt for the rest of your life, punishing yourself endlessly for something so entirely human and forgivable." "How can you know that?" he asked, his voice barely audible. "Because love does not disappear over one difficult morning," Clara said gently. "And because holding on to guilt this tightly does not honor her memory. It only continues to hurt you, endlessly, without ever allowing you the peace you deserve." He looked at her for a long moment, something shifting deeply within his tear-filled eyes, years of carefully guarded pain finally beginning to loosen their fierce grip upon his heart. "I do not know how to let it go," he admitted quietly. "I have carried this guilt for so long, it has become part of who I am, perhaps," Clara said softly, still holding his hand gently within her own. "Letting go does not mean forgetting the argument ever happened, or pretending the pain was not real. Perhaps it simply means finally forgiving yourself for being human, for having an ordinary disagreement on an extraordinary day that none of us could have predicted." He was quiet for a long moment, absorbing her words carefully, and then, slowly, deliberately, he lifted the teacup from its saucer, his hand trembling slightly as he brought it toward his lips. Clara held her breath, watching this simple, monumental action unfold before her, years of carefully preserved grief finally beginning to shift after this long overdue conversation. He paused, just before drinking, his eyes meeting hers with an expression of profound gratitude and vulnerability. "Thank you, Miss Bennet," he whispered. "Thank you for finally asking the question I never had the courage to answer honestly, even to myself." And then, for the first time in years, he took a small, tentative sip of tea, his eyes closing briefly, as though savoring not merely the taste, but the profound significance of this simple, healing action. Clara felt tears of joy and relief slip down her own cheeks, witnessing this quiet, powerful moment of healing unfold before her, understanding fully now the depth of grief and guilt that had shaped every single morning of this man's carefully guarded existence. "It is still warm," he said softly, almost in wonder, looking down at the cup in his hands. After all these years, I had forgotten how good it feels to actually taste it, rather than simply staring at it, frozen by guilt. Perhaps, Clara said gently, wiping her own tears away, this can be the beginning of something new, Your Grace. Not forgetting Charlotte, never that, but finally allowing yourself to move forward while still carrying her memory with love rather than guilt. He nodded slowly, setting the cup down with a newfound lightness in his expression, years of tension visibly easing from his shoulders. I believe you may be right, Miss Bennet. I believe it is finally time. Outside, the storm continued to rage against the windows, but within the study, something profound had shifted, a years-long burden finally beginning to lift, replaced by the quiet, tender beginnings of genuine healing. News of the Duke's transformation spread quickly through Ashcombe Hall, though none of the staff understood its true origin, believing simply that time had finally begun healing wounds that had lingered far too long. Margaret noticed it first, the lightness in his step as he moved through the halls each morning, the genuine warmth in his conversations with the household staff, the way he lingered over meals now rather than retreating immediately to solitary silence. Something has changed within him, she remarked to Clara one afternoon, as they worked together preparing the dining room for an upcoming gathering the Duke had unexpectedly requested. I have not seen him this at peace since before Charlotte's passing. Clara said nothing of the private conversation that had unfolded during that stormy morning, understanding instinctively that such a deeply personal moment belonged solely to the Duke, to share or withhold as he saw fit. But she felt a quiet pride nonetheless, knowing she had played some small part in helping him find this newfound peace. The morning tea ritual continued, though its meaning had shifted entirely. Now, each morning at 7 o'clock, Clara arrived with the tray, and the Duke drank his tea fully, savoring each cup with evident gratitude, their conversations growing warmer and more relaxed with each passing day. I find myself looking forward to these mornings more than I ever have before, he admitted, one particular morning, as autumn sunlight streamed through the study windows, a stark contrast to the storm that had accompanied their earlier, more difficult conversation. As do I, Your Grace, Clara replied honestly, unable to fully mask the warmth in her voice. He looked at her carefully, something thoughtful crossing his features. Miss Bennet, I have been considering something rather important, and I find myself uncertain how to proceed, given the complexities of our respective positions within this household. Clara felt her heart quicken at the seriousness in his tone. What do you mean, Your Grace? He set down his teacup carefully, choosing his words with evident care. These past months, our conversations have come to mean a great deal to me, more than I initially anticipated, or perhaps was entirely prepared to acknowledge. You have helped me find peace I believed impossible, and in doing so, you have become someone whose presence I value far beyond the ordinary boundaries of employer and servant. Clara's breath caught in her throat, uncertain where this conversation might lead, though her heart pounded with a mixture of hope and apprehension. I do not wish to presume anything inappropriate, he continued carefully, but I find myself unable to ignore the growing depth of feeling I have developed for you, Miss Bennet. I understand fully the complications such feelings present, given our respective stations, and I would never wish to place you in a position that felt uncomfortable or coerced in any manner. Clara felt tears prick at her eyes, moved deeply by his careful, respectful honesty. Your Grace, she said softly, I confess, I have felt something similar growing within my own heart these past months, though I too have hesitated to acknowledge it fully, given the obvious complications of our different positions. He looked at her with evident relief and hope, something warm and vulnerable in his expression. Then perhaps, he said carefully, we might explore what such feelings could mean, slowly, and with appropriate discretion, without placing undue pressure upon either of us. Clara nodded slowly, her heart swelling with a happiness she had not anticipated feeling so completely within these walls. I would like that very much, Your Grace. Over the following weeks, their relationship deepened gradually, conducted with careful discretion to avoid unnecessary gossip or scandal within the household, though those closest to them, particularly Margaret and Oliver, noticed the growing warmth between Clara and the Duke with quiet, knowing smiles. Lady Constance, upon eventually learning of this development through channels neither Clara nor the Duke could fully trace, arrived once again at Ashcombe Hall, her expression thunderous with disapproval. "Edmund, this is entirely inappropriate," she declared upon entering his study, barely acknowledging Clara's presence as she stood nearby. "A servant girl, Edmund? Have you lost all sense of propriety and family duty?" The Duke rose from his chair, his expression calm but firm, a strength Clara had not witnessed from him during Lady Constance's previous visits. "Constance, my personal affairs are no longer subject to your approval or interference. I have spent years allowing grief and family expectation to dictate my choices, and I am finished doing so. But the family name, the estate, what will people say?" Lady Constance began, though the Duke cut her off firmly. "The family name will endure regardless of whom I choose to love," he said steadily. "And as for what people say, I have grown considerably less concerned with such matters than I once was. Miss Bennet has shown me more genuine kindness, honesty, and understanding than anyone has offered me since Charlotte's passing, and I will not allow societal expectation to cost me a second chance at genuine happiness." Lady Constance stared at him for a long moment, clearly unaccustomed to such firm resistance from her cousin, before finally sighing heavily, her expression softening slightly, despite her evident continued reservations. "You have truly changed," she said quietly, almost to herself. "I suppose I should be grateful for whatever has restored some life to your eyes, even if I cannot fully approve of the method. Your concern for the estate and family name is not unfounded, Constance," the Duke said, his tone softening slightly in acknowledgement. "But I ask that you trust my judgment in this matter, as I have finally begun trusting my own heart again." Lady Constance departed shortly afterward, her disapproval evident though considerably softened from her initial reaction, leaving behind an uncertain peace that Clara hoped might eventually develop into genuine acceptance, given sufficient time. That evening, as the household settled into its familiar evening routines, the Duke found Clara in the small garden behind Ashcombe Hall, tending to the roses that Henry had so carefully maintained over the years, the same roses beneath which Charlotte's memorial stone remained quietly hidden. "I hope Lady Constance's visit did not distress you too greatly," he said, approaching her carefully. "I confess, it was somewhat unsettling," Clara admitted honestly, "though I understand her concerns, given the significant difference in our respective positions. Those differences matter far less to me than the genuine connection we have built together," the Duke said firmly, taking her hand gently within his own. "I have spent enough years allowing fear and expectation to dictate my choices. I do not intend to make that same mistake again." Clara smiled softly, moved deeply by his continued determination and honesty. "Then perhaps we might simply continue forward together, one day at a time, allowing our connection to grow naturally, regardless of whatever obstacles society may present." He nodded, lifting her hand gently to his lips in a tender, respectful gesture that spoke volumes about the genuine affection growing steadily between them. "I would like nothing more, Miss Bennet." They stood together quietly among the roses as evening settled gently over Ashcombe Hall, the memorial stone hidden beneath the blooms, serving as a quiet reminder of the love that had shaped this man so deeply, and the new chapter of healing and genuine connection now unfolding steadily before them both. Spring arrived at Ashcombe Hall with a warmth that had been absent from the old stone halls for many years, and the entire household seemed to breathe more easily beneath its gentle sunshine. Clara stood before the mirror in her small room, smoothing the fabric of a new dress the Duke had gifted her weeks earlier, her hands trembling slightly with a mixture of nervous excitement and quiet joy. Today marked the day she and Edmund, as she had finally grown comfortable calling him in private moments, would announce their engagement formally to the household staff, and, eventually, to the wider circle of family and society that surrounded Ashcombe Hall. The months since their initial confession of feelings had passed with steady, careful growth, each day building upon the genuine understanding and affection that had first blossomed during those quiet morning conversations over untouched cups of tea. Lady Constance, while never entirely enthusiastic about the match, had gradually softened her opposition, particularly after witnessing firsthand the genuine transformation in her cousin's demeanor, the return of laughter and warmth to a household that had grown accustomed to quiet grief. Margaret knocked softly on Clara's door, entering with a warm smile. "You look radiant," she said, helping adjust the final details of Clara's appearance. "Edmund waits for you in the garden." Clara felt her heart swell at these words, and together they made their way through the familiar halls of Ashcombe Hall, past portraits of ancestors long gone, past the rebuilt East Wing, where new memories were steadily replacing old sorrows, until they reached the garden, where Edmund waited among the roses, his expression filled with evident joy and anticipation. The staff had gathered quietly at his request, Oliver and Mrs. Ellery and Henry among them, their faces bright with genuine happiness for the couple who had found each other amid such unexpected circumstances. "Miss Bennet," Edmund said formally, though warmth and affection colored every word, "these past months have taught me more about genuine healing and happiness than I believed possible, after years of carrying grief so heavily. You arrived in this household as a quiet, observant stranger, and you leave, I hope, as someone who has fundamentally transformed not only my own heart, but the entire spirit of this house." Clara felt tears of joy gathering in her eyes as he continued. "I do not ask you to replace Charlotte's memory," he said gently, "for she will always remain a cherished, important part of who I am. But I ask you to walk beside me now, into whatever future awaits us, carrying both her memory and our own growing love together, side by side." He knelt then, producing a small ring that caught the spring sunlight beautifully, and Clara felt her heart overflow with a happiness she had never imagined possible when she first arrived at Ashcombe Hall so many months earlier. "Clara Bennet," he said, his voice steady with genuine emotion, "will you do me the profound honor of becoming my wife?" "Yes," Clara said immediately, tears streaming freely down her cheeks. "Yes, absolutely yes, Edmund." The gathered staff erupted into joyful applause and cheers, Oliver grinning broadly, Mrs. Ellery dabbing at her own happy tears, Henry nodding with quiet, satisfied approval, and Margaret embracing Clara warmly the moment Edmund rose from his knee. "I never imagined," Clara whispered, still overwhelmed with joyful emotion, "that a simple cup of tea could lead to something so profoundly beautiful." Edmund smiled warmly, pulling her gently into an embrace. "Nor did I," he admitted, "though I believe Charlotte would be genuinely pleased, knowing that same morning ritual eventually led me toward such genuine happiness once again." That evening, as celebrations continued quietly among the household staff, Clara found herself standing alone for a moment beside the rose garden, gazing down at the small memorial stone that Henry had so carefully restored, following its earlier disturbance months before. "Thank you," she whispered softly to the quiet stone, "for the love you shared with him, and for whatever small role your memory played in guiding us both toward this moment." She felt a gentle breeze move through the roses, carrying with it the sweet scent of spring blossoms, and she smiled softly, believing perhaps that Charlotte's spirit, wherever it now resided, offered its own quiet blessing upon this new beginning. In the months that followed, Ashcombe Hall transformed gradually into a home filled once again with genuine warmth and laughter, the morning tea ritual continuing steadily, though its meaning had evolved entirely from quiet grief into shared joy and partnership. Each morning, Clara and Edmund shared tea together, no longer as servant and employer, but as equal partners building a life together, their conversations filled with dreams for the future, rather than sorrows from the past. Lady Constance eventually arrived at genuine acceptance, even affection, for Clara, recognizing over time the profound positive transformation she had brought not only to Edmund's personal happiness, but to the broader well-being of the entire Ashcombe estate and its dedicated staff. Charlotte's memory remained honored and cherished throughout the household, her portrait eventually restored and displayed once again, not hidden away in grief, but celebrated as an important, beloved chapter in the ongoing story of Ashcombe Hall, a story that continued to unfold with each new sunrise, each shared cup of tea, and each quiet moment of genuine connection between two people who had found unexpected healing and happiness together. Years later, when their own children asked about the small stone hidden gently among the rose bushes, Clara would tell them softly about a woman named Charlotte, whose love had been so profound that even after her passing, it continued to shape and guide the hearts of those she left behind, ultimately leading toward new beginnings and genuine happiness for everyone fortunate enough to call Ashcombe Hall their home. And every single morning, precisely at 7 o'clock, a fresh cup of tea would still be poured, no longer left untouched in quiet grief, but shared joyfully between two people whose love had grown from unexpected beginnings into something truly lasting and beautiful. a gentle testament to the healing power of honesty, patience, and the simple, profound courage it takes to finally ask the question that matters most.